Welcome to KU Padasala. In this lecture, I will be speaking about English in India. We all know that English language is present in almost all realms of Indian life. We come across name boards of shops. We come across names of films. Our education, higher education especially, is in English. Our legal system uses English. Our civil administration, to a great extent, uses English. Our national media is mostly in English. Newspapers are also in English. Magazines, academic writings. So English is everywhere. And why this happens? For a person who is not familiar with the Indian life, Indian history, may not be able to understand the importance or the heavy presence of English in the Indian situation. But we know that English is an integral part of Indian life, or it has become an integral part of Indian life as a result of the colonial rule in India. It is in the beginning of 19th century, that is exactly by 1800, that the Britishers established themselves in India. But the British presence in India began much earlier. It is with the coming of East India Company. East India Company was formed in 1600, and its only aim was to have trade with India. When it was established in London by a group of businessmen, traders, they had the aim to have trade with India. They are in search of cotton, silk, sugar, salt, spices, and even opium. So they got permission from the Queen and also support from the government to come to India and to have trade with India. And it is in the year 1757, after the Plassey War, that the East India Company began to rule certain parts of India. So East India Company ruled India for about 100 years, beginning from 1757 to 1858. Even though they came with the aim of trading with India, they became the rulers of India. But after 1857, that is the year in which the so-called Sipahi rebellion happened, the British government took over the power from East India Company. So from 1858, the colonial British government started ruling India directly. The role of the company was over. So British rule in India, we can say, has transformed India altogether. It is not because they wanted to reform India, they wanted to serve the Indian people, but their aim, the primary aim, was to trade with India and to make money. And they used the rifts between the Indian rulers, because at that time India was not one nation. India was ruled by different small kings. Apart from the Mughal Empire, the others were all kings belonging to a small region. So the rift between these kings was used by the British to overpower them and to conquer almost majority of the portions of India. They also succeeded in eliminating other players in that region, like the French, the Dutch, etc. So, when we speak about the influence of English in India, we will have to trace the history of the introduction of English as a medium of instruction in India. We know that Indians came under the influence of English mainly after the introduction of English as a medium of instruction. The introduction of English language in India happened after a series of debates. At that time, the East India Company was advised to set apart at least 1 lakh rupees for inculcating scientific temperament and a kind of awareness about the value system of the West. So, this 1 lakh rupees was set apart by the East India Company for the same, but they waited for the decision on how to do this. So, based on that, there were several debates going on, whether to teach Indians in their own language or whether to teach them in English language. So, there were different opinions among Indians as well as among the British administrators, and a debate was going on. So, the Orientalists and the Occidentalists put forward their own arguments. One argument was that English language, if introduced, will help them to connect themselves with the Western culture, Western style of life, so that they will be able to, that is, the colonialists will be able to use them as middlemen between the government as well as the people. So, they need interpreters. Macaulay speaks about that particular term, interpreters, between the colonial government and the ordinary people. They can interpret because they know language. The colonial government needed such people who should connect the government with the people. So, they should know English. That is one argument. More than that, they also wanted to inculcate scientific temperament in the people, and for inculcating scientific temperament, knowledge of English will be useful. But primarily they were looking for people who can write and speak in English so that they can be used for administrative purposes, because the government, the colonial government, was finding it difficult to recruit people from England for all these purposes. So they needed Indians who are capable of doing this. So, K.M. Panikkar, speaking about the introduction of English in India, makes a very important assessment. He says that India was like Europe at that time, because in Europe you find several different languages, French, German, English, Spanish, etc. Different languages were there. India was also like that. India has different languages. We have Hindi, Punjabi, Bengali, Malayalam, Tamil, Kannada, etc. So, if English was not introduced, India in the post-independence period at least would have been divided into several countries based on the language, similar to the European system. It is English or in English language that connects all Indians, and it is because of the introduction of English that India remained as a single nation, and that is the argument put forward by Panikkar. And Aravind Krishna Mehrotra, another important critic, says that introduction of English into the complex hierarchical languages system has proved to be the most enduring aspect of this domination. the most enduring aspect of the colonial domination is the introduction of English language. That has done wonders to our society. We will have to look at this problem from two different angles. One is the colonial oppression, and the other is the kind of transformation created by English language. Because if we connect these two, we will forget about the impact of English over Indian society, because we most often focus on the political oppression of the colonialists and the kind of damage that the colonial administration has done in India. But when we look at the early administration under East India Company and the colonial government, the early administrators never wanted to impose English in India, because they thought that it will create aversion among Indians. So what they did is, the early administrators tried to learn Indian languages. For example, Warren Hastings, who was the governor of Bengal, he learned Bengali and Persian, and he even started a madrasa in Calcutta. So he never wanted to impose English. On the other hand, he tried to learn Indian languages so that he can communicate with Indians in their own language. Lord Cornwallis was also a person who learned Sanskrit, and he established the Sanskrit College in Benares in the year 1792. We are familiar with Herman Gundert, who learned Malayalam and produced the first dictionary in Malayalam. So any number of examples can be cited for this. So the missionaries as well as the colonial administrators tried to learn Indian languages. They translated some of the seminal works of Sanskrit into English, like Shakuntala, and some of them became good scholars in Sanskrit as well as in the Indian regional languages. So all this happened in the beginning. But English education or introduction of English as a medium of instruction happened later. And we know that many Indians were in favor of that. We cannot say that it was imposed forcefully by the British. Raja Ramamohan Roy was an advocate of English education. Raja Ramamohan Roy, he was a scholar in English, he learned English, and he argued for the introduction of English. And he has his own reasons, because he thought that Sanskrit will never help us to come or to emerge as a modern nation. Sanskrit is an old language. It will drag us back to the darkness of the past. That is what he felt. So he wanted English, because English language, he was sure, will bring about modernity. It will teach people about equality, democracy, fraternity, etc. So he advocated the introduction of English. He started Hindu College in 1817. We all know that he was part of the Brahma Samaj movement. Even though he was an advocate of the Western culture, tradition, language, etc., he rooted his philosophy in the Vedas, the Vedic philosophy. So his philosophy was a mixture of the East and the West. The introduction of English language in India created a new generation of people, the English educated young men. And the English educated young men, full of energy, full of desire to learn about the West, full of desire to criticize the superstitious Indian practices, Indian tradition, etc., It is they who produced the early writings in English. We know that the East India Company's and later the British government's approach was also in support of them, in support of this group. They were well placed in government jobs. Some of them became barristers, and they got opportunity to acquaint themselves with the Western literature, Western philosophy, Western practices, and all these helped them to come up with modern ideas about life. The nationalism and the reform movements, all these are actually outbursts of the influence of English education in India. So when we speak about the influence of Macaulay's Minutes and the subsequent developments in the Indian context, I think we should go back to Macaulay first. His famous argument in favor of English is known to everybody. Macaulay, in his famous Minutes published in 1835, says, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern." We referred to that earlier. And when he speaks about a class of persons, he refers to the English educated Indians, a class of persons. And according to him, they are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. So this phrase describing the newly English educated Indians who are referred as a class of people, a different group of people, I think in this expression itself we find the aim and objectives of the British at that time. That is, they are trying to develop a different group of people. Different means different from the traditional Indians who are completely immersed in the superstitious practices of the past. They are trying to develop a new kind of people, a new generation of people who can imbibe the Western approach, Western scientific approach, the rational approach of the West, and work for the company, work for the government, colonial government. He continues, "To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects." So that also is mentioned here. So it may be that the colonial administrators, including Macaulay, wanted to present the idea that they are trying to civilize the Indian population. That is why he refers to this, refine the vernacular dialects with science borrowed from the Western nomenclature. We find that this reference to reformation is certainly important because, as Ashish Nandi says, the colonialists cannot remain confident without the agenda of reform, civilization, civilizing the natives. So civilizing the natives is one of the agendas of the colonialists, mainly because they feel a kind of a sense of guilt because they have been exploiting these people, they have been ill-treating these people, and without this agenda of civilization they cannot face Indians confidently. So even though Macaulay refers to this, we cannot be sure, or I don't feel that Macaulay actually means it. civilization is not one of the primary agendas of the West. Their main agenda is exploitation, but civilization is used as a mask. But Macaulay's minutes, Macaulay's ideology and Macaulay's arguments are viewed from a different angle at present. We find that most of us learned in textbooks and in history books that Macaulay had no sense of our past. Macaulay viewed our tradition as worthless because in his famous minutes he refers to the Indian literature and the Western English literature, and he says that if we put all important works of Indian literature on one side of the balance and put Shakespeare on the other side, Shakespeare will weigh more. So yes, it is true that he has total ignorance of Indian tradition, Indian literature, Indian philosophy, etc. But he is making an argument saying that, or believing that, the British literature and British Western tradition is far greater than the Indian tradition. Anyway, Macaulay has been criticized for such arguments, but looking at Macaulay from a totally different point of view, that is the Dalit point of view, a lot of studies have come up which argues that English language has created wonders in Indian society, in the sense that introduction of English language sidelined the Sanskrit language. Sanskrit language was sidelined by the introduction of English language. Until then, Sanskrit was the dominant language, and Sanskrit is learned and used by the upper strata of the society, the Brahmins and the upper caste. The lower caste people are not permitted to learn Sanskrit, and they have been kept away from that tradition. So with the introduction of English, all the people, that means people belonging to the upper caste as well as the lower caste, began to learn language. They were admitted in school, and this created a kind of transformation in the age-old caste system, which was based on a kind of discrimination. That is, the lower caste people were kept away from the mainstream. They were kept away from education system. They were not permitted to enter the school, or they cannot get access to education until then. But now, with the introduction of English, everybody gets access. For example, if you go to Talicheri, there is a Brennan school, which is now a B.Ed college. And in that Brennan school, it is written, in a stone, it is written that this school is open to people belonging to all castes and creeds. It is specifically written because until then or before that, lower caste people were not allowed to enter the school. They were not given education. So, introduction of English created a sea change in the lifestyle of the lower caste people. They began to get education, and more than that, the kind of social cultural system that bases itself on Sanskrit scholarship began to disappear, and English brought about a new kind of culture, new kind of literature, a new kind of social system. So the Macaulay's Minutes actually was a kind of document which liberated the lower caste people of India. That is the argument. So Macaulay has been viewed differently by different people. We will have to look at both sides. And it is true that a kind of scientific rational outlook was introduced by the new kind of education, the English education in India. We became familiar with the Western philosophy, Western literature, Western history, Western science. We became aware of the French Revolution, the idea of secularism, equality, fraternity, etc. All these happened because of English education. And Jadunath Sarkar writes that Indian Renaissance is the best gift of the English. Indian Renaissance is the best gift of the English. It brought about an awakening in India, which was stagnant for several centuries. Indian social life was stagnant for several centuries. It got an awakening, a transformation. And Lord Curzon, speaking about the introduction of English, argues that we are trying to graft the science of the West with the Eastern stem. We are trying to graft the science of the West with the Eastern stem. A grafting happened. The science of the West, the rational outlook of the West is grafted with the East. The East is considered to be dominantly spiritual, metaphysical in nature, and the rational scientific outlook of the West is grafted with that stem, so that there is a sudden transformation in its outlook, in its perspective, and in the very way of life. So the early Indian writing originated out of this spirit for inquiry, the kind of enthusiasm that originates out of the exposure that they received from the English language, reading English literature, Western philosophy, Western history, etc. Raja Ramamohan Roy is one of the early prose writers in English. And Henry Derosio is the first Indian poet to write in English. Kashi Prasad Ghosh, K.M. Banerjee are some of the early writers. And when we look at all these early writers, we find that they are highly critical of the Indian tradition. In their writing, in their prose writing as well as in their poetry, they criticized the Indian tradition. They tried to challenge the Indian practices. Raja Ramamohan Roy's fight against Sati is very famous. And there were movements for widow remarriage. Widows were treated very badly at that time. They were never allowed to get out of the room, or they were burned along with the dead body of the husband. So widow remarriage happened, or movements for that happened there, not in almost all parts of India, not only in Bengal. In Kerala also we come across such movements among different castes, among Nambudiris and different castes. So it created a kind of renaissance, a kind of reformation, a kind of revolution, we can say, as far as Indian culture is concerned. And the early Indian writing in prose as well as in poetry originated out of the impact of English education on India. And when we look at the literary forms, we find that prose was something that was not actually present in the Indian languages at that time. Even though there were some kinds of prose, it was not a literary or a kind of creative writing. That came with the English. Poetry was of a very different type, very long poems, translations of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and they were very much religious in nature. So secular poetry was to a great extent absent in Indian languages, including Sanskrit at that time. Drama was also religious oriented. the very old Kudiyatam and Kathakali of Kerala, Yakshaganam of Karnataka, and many other forms of art. We find that they are all religious or based on religion or religious stories connected with religion in some way or other. So the secular kind of literature began with the English or familiarity with English. So modern prose, poetry, lyrical poetry or modern style of writing poetry, and novel. We never had a tradition of novel. We have a tradition of stories, Vikramaditya stories, Jataka stories, etc. But the novel emerged as a result of the influence of English. We find that most of the early novels written in Indian languages were imitations of the Western stories. Even Indulekha is a novel written by Chandu Menon for his wife to read. He says in the introduction itself that he has written this novel modeled on the novels of Walter Scott in English. Since his wife cannot read and understand English, he wrote a novel in Malayalam for her to read. Moreover, he also speaks about the fact that the kind of stories that the Indian people are interested in are superstitious stories and stories that are unbelievable. So he wanted to familiarize them with somewhat realistic stories, stories about the real experiences of people. So Indulekha emerges as a novel that attempts to address contemporary life instead of the superstitious, unbelievable stories of the past. So in most of the languages, the same is true. So when we look at English and its impact on India, we find that its impact is so complex and so wide that we cannot comprehend the whole idea of the influence of English in one sentence or in one class or in one book, because we find that, we experience that English has influenced the life of each and every Indian in wide variety of ways. It has inculcated a new vision, a new way of looking at life, a new kind of approach to life, different from our traditional approach. At the same time, it is also true that English is the language of the colonialists. The colonial oppression and the benefits of learning English are two different factors. They have to be treated differently. We cannot mix English with the colonial regime or the oppressive nature of the colonial regime. Even though they are connected, I think the impacts are totally different. So I think any study on the impact of English in India will have to approach the language English differently from the colonial atrocities and the colonial exploitation that happened in India. We find that not only literature but our culture and our everyday life itself is still being influenced by English, and the importance of English is growing in the contemporary period because English has acquired the status of a global language and it is growing day by day. And I think at present we will have to consider English as an Indian language. And I think Sahitya Academy started considering Indian literature in English as a branch of Indian literature itself. Kamala Das once referred to this act of writing in English. She was actually reacting to the criticisms against her. And her statement, I think, will be a fitting answer to the critics who believe that English is a foreign language and we need not attempt to write in English. We should write in our own native language itself. Kamala Das, in one of her poems titled Introduction, reacts to this issue. She writes, "Don't write in English," they said. "English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone? Critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you. Why not let me speak in any language I like? The language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its queernesses, all mine alone." This is what she says about her use of English as a medium for writing poetry. So I think the issue of English in India, its impact as well as its relevance in India, is a very vast issue, and it has been debated in the past and is being debated in the present. I think the debates should continue. Thank you very much for listening.